And you described yourself as a materialist kind of before this book started. You've also spent a lot of your life studying plants in many different ways, and you had some new relationships with plants, when you were in your backyard for that non-guided experience. And I've had some amazing relationships with plants.
Are you a gardener?
I'm not, but when I'm on the psychedelic experiences, I have them. And then now, even without them, when I'm in the Hampstead Heath here, I just find myself very much attracted and seeing wisdom in these plants. And again, like, I was trained in engineering, so none of this stuff comes natural to me. But now that when I see it, I have a tendency to really stare at trees when I'm having a psilocybin experience in the nature, and I can stare at them for hours. And I have a lot of the realizations that you've come to in some of your work, like, wow, look at this tree. It's been here for a few hundred years. It's going to be here for a few hundred years. It must look down at us humans and say, look at all you silly little animals running around, flashing your bling, trying to get on the New York Times bestseller list. And guess what? We're going to be here. It's fun to watch you guys. And then, by the way, could you plant me over there? Thank you very much. And so, but I'm curious, what you saw, did you see spirituality there? And what is that to you?
Well, we have to talk about the definition of spirituality, but I had a very profound experience with plants in my garden on this psilocybin trip. Now, you should understand, I've always given plants a lot of credit. I've written about plant intelligence. I wrote a piece for The New Yorker a couple years ago. And in Botany of Desire, my third book, I wrote about the reciprocal relationship we have with plants, that we think we're working on them and they're doing what we want, when we mow the lawn or whatever. But in fact, the grasses have manipulated us into mowing that lawn so the trees can't come up and shade them and ruin their habitat. So they're manipulating us too. They have, not intentionally, this is just evolution, this is co-evolution, that they use us, we use them. That's how co-evolution works. We're not aware of how we're used. In the same way, the honeybee, is not aware when it's breaking into the flower on the apple tree and stealing the nectar, that in fact it's been manipulated to do exactly that, and without its knowledge it's carrying pollen on its legs and taking it to some other flower. We're much more like the bee than we realize. And so I understood this intellectually. This was an idea I developed in Botany of Desire. But man, I felt it for the first time, that these plants in my garden were regarding me in some sense. They don't have eyes or anything, but they were just like, their presence, the sense that they did have, that I wasn't the only subject. Normally we think we're the only subject, everything else is an object. No, they were subjects too. They were spirits in that sense everywhere. And it's a very common phenomenon on psychedelics to have this sense that consciousness is more evenly spread over the world and not just locked in here, and that other beings are more alive than you realized. And I definitely had that with these plants. And I felt like I was one character among many in this garden, rather than the human overseeing the garden. And it was a deeper connection to nature than I'd ever felt. I don't think there's anything supernatural about that. I would say it's spiritual in this sense. And this will just take a minute to develop. But what happened to me, as I said earlier, I didn't think I'd had a spiritual experience.
Which kind of surprised me.
Yeah, I know, but it didn't feel like I had. I mean, the way I talked about plants sounds kind of spiritual, just what I was saying. But I assumed that spiritual meant supernatural in some sense, that you had to leave the laws of nature and science, and it was an experience that refuted them by showing you that there was some divine force you weren't aware of, or God, or whatever it was. And I didn't buy that. And but I came to understand spirituality in a different way over the course of writing this book. And that was that the opposite of spiritual is not material, as I had thought. The opposite of spiritual is egotistical. And that it is ego and the ego defenses that wall us off from the kinds of really powerful connections that constitute a spiritual experience. I'm talking about the experience of love for someone else or for nature. I'm talking about feeling like you're part of nature, you have that deep connection with nature. The ego keeps us, puts these walls up. It patrols the boundary between self and other. It tends to encourage us to objectify the other. And not see that there are other subjects looking back at us all over the world, like your tree. And So when I came to understand that that was the opposite, that I was having spiritual experiences, and they were experiences of deep, powerful connection. And that's what I think spirituality is. Now, for some people, that connection is with some idea of the divinity and higher power. And I can totally even see that in a naturalistic sense. So I don't think I've given up my materialism, but I have acquired a spirituality without giving it up. And that was a big surprise for me, and a big turn. And I've realized since that to the extent I can lower the voice of my ego, I can make available those kind of connections.